This is From the Wheelhouse with Annapolis School of Seamanship.
Welcome back. I'm Captain John Martino. This is Captain Matt Benhoff. We're from Annapolis School of Seamanship, and we have Todd Lochner from Lochner Law Firm. This is From the Wheelhouse, and we're going to be talking about, today, we're going to be talking about what's in a word, the word being captain. And Todd, you and I have had this conversation many a times. Matt, you and I have had this conversation many times. That word gets batted around quite a bit. And it means different things in different contexts. That's the long and short of it. So, Todd, if you were going to characterize some of these contexts that I think that the people watching have to understand, where would you start?
Well, in playing to the audience that we're anticipating, which is primarily a recreational boating audience, I would say that the biggest issue is what is expected of the captain. And what should the captain expect that the passengers or the owner or the charterer are expecting of them when they sign on to do a job? And I think those things can be radically different. I think that they can be handled by contract and they can be handled by the law. And there are quite a few instances in which the expectations are not met in either circumstance. And I think that's the number one thing to deal with, is what is expected. And what are the actual roles that a captain should take in those recreational contexts?
I've always followed the rules that you're responsible for the safe operation and navigation of the vessel and safety of the passengers and crew.
Yeah, clearly, and we've been involved in cases about this stuff. But in terms of the actual safe operation of the vessel, I feel like that's pretty ubiquitous when it comes to, the captain's responsible for the safe operation of the vessel. But what about beyond that? And I always think about, if we're talking about a situation where this is an inspected vessel that's taking passengers, groups of passengers, a small passenger vessel, it's pretty clear that the captain has a great deal of authority. But in situations such as when a captain's hired to go onto a private boat, a privately owned boat for some reason, now the owner's on board, things are a little bit different. Or a bareboat charter where we need some of that Latin, please, that you talk about bareboat charter.
A bareboat charterer is also known as an owner pro hoc vice, so he who stands in the shoes of the owner. And that is when the vessel in its entirety is handed over to the charterer. And in that circumstance, along with when an owner is aboard, that's where things get a little more sticky for the captain. Specifically, what exactly are their roles vis-a-vis the charterer and the charterer's guests in a bareboat charter scenario? And this is a situation that we've run into and litigated, because we don't necessarily have a 100% clear answer in all of the jurisdictions. We finally have one now in the Fourth Circuit after having some litigation on this point. And I will just preface, everything that I'm saying is in the public record, and this is not a breach of any confidentiality agreements or otherwise. In the public record, what's available is that a gentleman chartered a vessel from a charter company, and there was a requirement that a captain must be there. He could have brought anyone. Well, he chose a captain. The captain came aboard, and ultimately the charterer decided that they wanted to go swimming while they were partying. So you add alcohol, you add water, etc. And someone died. They ended up having their feet stuck in the mud and not coming back up. Now ultimately, the plaintiff's counsel made the argument that the captain had a duty to be a lifeguard and a tour guide when he was hired by the charterer.
How do you feel about that?
I've never seen it anywhere.
Yeah. You didn't find that in your captain's manual?
No manuals, no books. I've not seen that.
Right. So, and that was where I guess you asked me to weigh in on the case. And it's interesting, and that was the first. I mean, it took me a while to really kind of stew on it. There was the contract. I don't remember all the details, whether or not there was a contract with the captain or whether the captain was just hired. But I do remember that we dealt with the boundaries of that obligation. In this case, the boat was anchored,
Yep.
and there was a party going on. And so if you're the captain of a boat in that situation, whether you're with an owner or whether you're a charterer, to us it doesn't make any difference. If it's a bareboat charter, like Todd said, that charterer is the standing in the owner's shoes. So for our purposes, that's as if the owner was on board. They're in control of the overall voyage, if you will, whereas the captain, I see a distinction where the captain's responsible for safe navigation and everything else. I'm not there to police a party, which is a very different situation than an inspected vessel or a small passenger vessel or such that is or even a time charter, where you have that command authority over all aspects of what happens on that vessel.
Well, like I said, that's where the passengers are paying for the captain to get them from point A to point B safely. In this case, the captain was there to drive the boat safely, keep it navigated safely, but it was anchored, and I see the difference there.
So in this context, in this particular case, the argument that the captain had an obligation under the law to act as a lifeguard once people were swimming and to act as a tour guide generally is not something that the court said was in the inherent responsibilities of a captain who was brought on by the charterer/owner, or the owner pro hoc vice. So in that circumstance, we finally have something in writing from a court that says, there's a parameter. But what happens most of the time is you want to try to deal with this in a contract context.
I would much rather have it pretty well explained in a contract than to try to be arguing in court what the law says.
And this is one of the reasons that we try very hard to make sure that all captains are actually not doing it on a handshake, but actually having something in writing with the owner or owner pro hoc vice, whomever is hiring them. They need to know who's hiring them. And they also need to reduce that to writing. The times of doing these things on a handshake are long gone.
Even when you're doing deliveries, I see a lot of captains who take deliveries and they take the owners with them. So, and I always tell them this becomes a problem because who's the boss? Who's the last word? So.
And one of the things that I write in is that very point, is that it is the owner's ability and responsibility to nominate ports, but it is the captain's responsibility to say, we're not going there, safe berth, safe port, navigational hazard reasons, we're not. And they get that final say, even though the owner may have nominated the port.
Right.
So in most areas of business, because this is business, it helps to have a contract that clearly lays out who's responsible for what. It's interesting to see how often this very topic comes up. I imagine you've dealt with these cases in deliveries, in bareboat charters, and so on. So I think it's important for us to talk maybe to the audience a little bit about if you are chartering a vessel, bareboat, and you are hiring captains, and I think we did cover this in another podcast, but it's important to note that you can hire anyone to be that captain as long as it's accepted by the owner. Isn't that right? It doesn't have to be from the pre-approved list.
Generally speaking, if it is a bareboat charter, you are able to hire anyone. However, you will find that there are certain limitations which are available. It has to be someone who is acceptable to the insurance carrier, for example. So you don't want to walk up on the day of your charter and say, here's Captain Ron, just to choose randomly from the movie Icon.
I wondered if you were going to pull his name.
Yeah, indeed. Well, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen out there. Right?
Yeah, right.
Captain Ron quote, if you haven't seen the movie, go do so. But by all means, you can't just walk up on the day of and say, here's my guy. It has to be someone that's acceptable to the owner, that would be approved by the carrier. And so what many charter companies do is they will say, you can get anybody you want, but to try to be helpful here, here's a list of folks who have been pre-approved by the carrier. And
Right.
so you still could, but you can't walk up the last moment and expect that you're going to be able to do something like that, because there are certain guardrails that are reasonable and appropriate.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah. If I'm the owner or the charter company and Captain Ron walks up, the answer is no.
Hey, you can't just run Captain Ron down. He got them there.
He did get them there.
That worked out fine.
Yeah.
You have to see the movie if you haven't already.
So, Todd, outside of a contract, let's say that there's a situation where, people are operating, which happens every day, outside of a written contract. Where will we look for the applicable law in something like this? Or is it largely precedent?
It's largely precedent. I mean, we have something here in the Fourth Circuit which starts to outline what is the outlier. We now know that a captain is not necessarily a tour guide and is not a lifeguard once people are swimming at the direction of the charterer. So we now have that. We don't have that in all places, and you have to look in various places. Years ago, one of the places where it was pushed in the opposite direction was out on the West Coast. And, you got the alfalfa, avocado crowd out there, real kind of lefty, pushing the limits of who can be responsible, etc. And there was a captain who was out on a booze cruise on a J-24 who was not in command and control. It was his friend's boat. He just happened to be aboard. And the court out there, perhaps incorrectly, but nonetheless did it, said, well, wait a minute, he has some special knowledge, and he had to step in at some point, even though he was not hired, was not there to be a captain, and was not acting under the color of his license. So you have all these conflicting things, which may not be good rules for other jurisdictions that you're operating in.
Yeah, I want to take that up because you and I have talked about this a number of times, and we talked about that being specifically one of the topics for the podcast, and that being, how often do we hear, Matt, people call and say, oh, I don't want to get my captain's license. Or
I don't want the liability.
I don't want the liability.
That was going to be my next comment. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Because my response to them is, if you're the captain of the boat, whether you're licensed or not, you're responsible. And so I don't know that now you bring up this case where somebody who was licensed, who was, to me, and I haven't read the facts of the case, that doesn't sound like good law.
I'm not saying it was good law by any means. I'm saying it was an outlier.
Yeah.
But you were asking.
Hopefully the judge isn't watching.
Well, probably retired by now. I think that was 25, 30 years ago. But, in any event, I mean, the point is that it's not good law, but the question you ask is, where do you look? You have to go and you have to figure this stuff out. Or you go to your school where you have done this type of work to figure out what the rules are and where the outliers are, et cetera, et cetera.
We're really good at saying, you know what, we're going to stop there and you need to call Todd. Because we're not lawyers, but we do find ourselves dealing with regulation and these types of things and expert witness all the time. And so you pick up a lot along the way, but this is one of those areas where people are discouraged from getting education. Like, they don't want to go to a captain's license course where they're actually going to learn the rules of the road to a level that all operators should understand. But only people who've been through captain's license training really learn it to that level, and they have to pass with a 90% on that test. They're going to learn the practices of safe navigation, and they're going to learn a lot of regulatory stuff that they never wanted to know, and I can't say that I blame them, but they're going to learn all that stuff. So these people are being discouraged from getting that education on the basis that they're exposing themselves to greater liability. Are they really? Because my argument is, well, if you're a licensed captain, you're a professional mariner, aren't you a more credible witness?
Well, you might be more credible, but I think the nuts and bolts for people is that they will have a lower insurance premium, or they'll actually be able to get insurance. I have someone right now who can't get insurance because he's never owned a boat over X number of feet for the 40-foot new boat. Now, I've also had situations in COVID where we had a guy who was, hey, I've got a 65-foot boat. Next week, my wife said, let's make it 75 feet. But I can't get insurance. I've never owned a boat before.
We get that too.
Right. So there's a lot of that. And more, frankly, these minor, perhaps completely unwarranted concerns, unless you happen to be out in California, about extra duties related to your having a license. And I think that case has now been discredited, but there are outliers like that. Certainly it's had its negative treatment as being the wrong rule. Really the plus side is you're getting a lower premium, or you're even able to get insurance where you may not otherwise get any cover at all.
So there's a practical argument. But from a liability point of view, if you are operating your own boat and you're carrying friends or a family on board, you're responsible.
You ultimately are, and you may have the knowledge that you want to fill out an extra form in the event of a casualty. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't even have to fill out in a non-commercial context the 2692 Coast Guard forms.
Right.
But a lot of states have their own form, or they use a variation of a form if there's a casualty that is death or a grievous injury or damage over $2,500 or $5,000, depending upon where the state is. And bureaucrats love forms. So the failure to file a form like that to the Department of Natural Resources or some other entity might become a problem. Although it's kind of funny, DNR has on its books here in the state of Maryland that you have to file such a form. They don't even know what it is. Anyway, but that's DNR is a whole different discussion. I have plenty of people that are very good DNR officers. I've seen plenty that are absolutely horrific and need to be trained here.
Oh, all right, I'm going to stay off of that one.
We should have the DNR in and have a point-counterpoint a la the Jane Aykroyd, Dan Curtin.
I'm going to be
SNL.
Switzerland on that conversation, if that's all right.
So back to it though, whether you're licensed or unlicensed, you're still responsible. And if you are licensed and you're not being engaged as the captain, you're not being held to a higher liability. Is that what?
Essentially, if you're not acting under the color of your license, that's where you get into difficulty.
Right.
And when acting under the color of your license and you fail to do something appropriately, the Coast Guard can revoke your license, which is a whole nother discussion.
Correct.
Which for a whole nother podcast.
I mean, if I go out with a buddy on his boat, I'm not responsible for what he is doing. I mean, if he's driving the boat and I'm sitting in the back, as a passenger on that boat, just because I don't believe, and I would be happy to litigate, if I was being accused, I'm not responsible for what he's doing on that boat.
Right, and of course, I'm a hired gun, so I'll take the counterpoint.
Mm-hmm.
The argument I would make, whether it's an appropriate argument or not, I'm not saying.
Yeah.
But the argument I would make is that you have specialized knowledge, and you can't fail to use your specialized knowledge to help avoid a casualty.
I could say you shouldn't do that, but but I have no authority.
Well, that's the difference is, do you have the authority to physically stop someone from doing something just because you're a captain? That's completely different. And we have that answered in part by this decision we've been discussing.
Yes.
Which is you don't have the right as a captain to go and physically tackle someone because they're about to jump in the water.
Right.
And you're acting as a lifeguard. We've already said we don't have to act as a lifeguard in this jurisdiction.
I love analogies. So, I mean, when Matt and I are driving down the road, if I'm driving my car, Matt has a driver's license. He can't grab the wheel and, and tell me, you shouldn't be doing that, or, so it doesn't make any sense to me. It defies logic and reasonableness that you could expect a licensed mariner who's casually on board as a passenger, that they would have any kind of authority to step and do something. You can certainly say something. You can certainly make suggestions. You might not get invited back out again, but
Well, the court here in the Fourth Circuit has begun to lay out some of the parameters of what is not expected of a captain just because they have that label.
Mm-hmm. Right. And honestly, there's no license that says captain on it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there's operators' licenses and there's master's licenses, and there's mate's licenses. But it doesn't say captain on it, so.
Indeed. The entire word is a construct in our own lexicon, what we think it means.
Right. Which is good for you.
I love the gray area. God bless the gray area.
All right. Well, I think we dealt with what's in a word. Of course, there's no finishing this conversation because it just goes on and on. So, but at any rate, any last thoughts, Matt?
No, that's about all of it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we have to stop it somewhere because we could continue on.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to see more of this, please subscribe to the channel. And what do they say? Ring the bell.
Like and follow for more.
Yeah. All right.
Outstanding.
Well, thank you very much. It's been from the Wheelhouse.